Let's postulate a thought experiment for a bit here. You, the viewer, have been tasked with modernizing an old manga from the 60s. How might you go about that? Now, knowing you as I do, I'm going to go ahead and assume that you definitely said, well, I figured I'd have the main character be mute for essentially 2/3 of the show, thus proving that you definitely deserve your place as one of the greats of adaptation alongside Peter Jackson, Horton Foote, and whoever directed the Peerless Monster Girl quest OVAs. Hello, I'm Aaox, and this is Dororo, notable for being both a supernatural samurai action show and a fun experiment in trying to get away with paying for as little of a voice actor's time as physically possible. Welcome to beautiful pre-feudal Japan, where crime rates are low, satisfaction is high, and nobody's a stranger, they're just friends you haven't met yet. Yes, Japan was a rather abjectly miserable place back in the Sengoku Jidai, but that century war does mean it's the perfect setting in which to tell a story that's all about struggling with some personal demons, if you catch my drift. No pleasant peasant villages or idyllic rice paddies here, just sodden grey muck pockmarked with the odd cadaver to spruce up the place. Everyone is miserable, everyone is eating tree bark, everyone is on death's door, and everyone cannot get enough of it. Take Yakimaru, for example, whose father engaged in a little bit of Faustian bargaining with his unborn son as collateral. The demons take his son's body, his land prospers. Hyaki's rather understandably miffed with this arrangement, so he sets out to kill the offending demons and reclaim his stolen body parts with his plucky little tag-along vagabond, Dororo, happily trotting along beside him. And off they go, the gruesome twosome, both wonderful characters in their own right. Except, of course, I'm telling a fib there, and I do apologize for that, because as I rather ham-fistedly crammed into the kickoff jokes there, one of the most important things to note going into this one is that Hyakimaru rarely ever talks. He barely even mumbles, in fact, for the first few episodes at least, providing an unintentional and disenchanting mirror towards my own capacity for any degree of personal social interaction. It places the show somewhere between avant-garde and devoid of a protagonist, but that's underscoring what the show manages to achieve in its other aspects. There's a lot going on here thematically, and keep in mind that anime is a visual medium. You don't need words to tell a complex story, although, in fairness, they do help quite a bit. Unfortunately, when you've got a sort of buddy cop, master and protege chunk and that one funny-looking fellow from the Goonies vibe going on, it really hurts the dynamic to have half of the team be devoid of admittedly trivial things like speech and basic human emotion, because it means the other half has to essentially carry being the narrative voice for most of the show's runtime. Now, in a perfect world, we'd get a really great character to fill that role.
But this is not a perfect world.
Yes, the titular Dororo is a young girl who, when she's not explaining the plainly visible or melodramatically yelling Aniki for the 50th time that episode, has her work essentially cut out for her, holding all of the various plot threads together, which has a similar effect on her character's consistency that the old method of execution where they'd tie a person's limbs to 4 horses and send them running off in different directions had on the future prospects of the aforementioned victim. Just another example of why the world was a better place before the introduction of so-called human rights. Is she a scared, wounded orphan? Is she a plucky thief with a heart of gold? Is she a respectful moral compass? What is the real depth of her relationship with Hyakimaru? Great questions, not so many answers. She's essentially doing the work of 2 characters whilst trying to find time to have her own dark and brooding backstory, and without question, your opinion on whether Dororo, the 2019 animated television program, is good or not is going to be heavily influenced by your opinion of Dororo, the 2019 animated television character. Still, she's a pretty good thief. After all, she did manage to steal the name of the show, because whilst calling Hyakimaru a blank slate would be a misnomer, he's definitely not the most interesting character in the show he's ostensibly the protagonist of. This is something I think could have been easily remedied by simply having him actually start talking like a regular human being earlier in the show's runtime, ideally before episode 12. It would fix a few more problems on top of that. Even at episode 20, he's still stumbling through basic sentences, and whilst it does make logical sense that one wouldn't immediately be able to go from being deafblind to having full control over the Japanese language, I was of the understanding we'd sort of abandoned strict adherence to reality around the time the magical ghost monsters stole the body parts from the hyper-advanced prosthetic-laden blind samurai ninja warrior baby. I do wonder, and this is just speculation as I've not seen it, to what extent the show's lack of characterization is built around the fact that the show has already been animated once before in the very funny year 1969, and thus this is technically the second attempt to revitalize this thing, sort of like the Dororo equivalent of The Amazing Spider-Man, or World War II. Obviously, it's a rather sizable cultural touchstone in its native market, so this might be where my position as one of those disgusting, clueless foreigners really plays a part in my relative lack of understanding. Maybe they don't want to see another origin story. Maybe they wanted to dramatically alter the protagonist and get away from the source material. Maybe they wanted to finally cater to the oft-ignored mime demographic. Who can say for sure? Something you'll notice about Hyakimaru of the aforementioned 1969 animated adaptation is that, well, take a look. Notice anything about this absolute stallion of a man? That's right, he has lovely eyes. Also, less notably, he's talking right now, from the first episode onwards even. Also, his kimono isn't covered with a symbol that looks very much like a butt plug. Someone mentioned it to me a few days ago, and now I can't stop seeing it. This all sounds rather negative, and that's likely because in a lot of ways it is, but there's more to Dororo than just its characters. That said, there's not many positives I can list off without first taking a deep breath and saying, but. Oh. The fighting animation is at times exhilarating and incredible. I mean, look at that, that's terrific, but sometimes it's... I don't know how this happened. Were they running their antivirus while they were rendering this sequence? At its best, however, Dororo almost feels like a series of twists on Grimm's old macabre fairy tales, with nobody really getting away with anything scot-free. Everyone loses something every episode, and even when Hyaki gains a body part back, usually it's to his detriment or in miserable circumstances. When he gets his sense of smell back, where else could he be but in a sulfur field? When he gets his hearing back, how could the first sound he hears be anything but the grief-racked sobbing of a woman whose brother he just murdered? When he gets his sense of pain back, is it not only natural that his first experience with it should be to step into a fire pit? Misery is to Dororo what genocidal Western advancement was to Americans in the 19th century. It's just destiny. The atmosphere is also fantastic. It quite literally drips with it. I mentioned before how everything feels miserable, but you almost feel like shivering watching some of the aspects of the show. The rare breaks in the grey are very pretty and well earned, but even then the beauty is often tainted by some sort of sorrow. Tainted beauty and the suffering wrought by the war are constant presences throughout the story, and they're welcome additions, especially for a story that isn't afraid to get morally complex. At first I thought Tahomaru, Hyakimaru's younger brother, would be a hate-filled villain of the week, for example. However, his reasons for fighting Hyaki are completely understandable. With every body part Hyakimaru gets back, Daigo's land returns to its previous destitute state, causing everyone who lives there unimaginable suffering. Is Hyaki right to want his body back? Yes, he is. Is Hyaki's life more important than the thousands of people his quest is dooming to starvation and death? No, I don't think it is. So that leaves us in a pretty complicated space, and I can't stress this enough. That's a very good thing. It sure would be nice if he had a character that made him compelling or interesting, however, because in lieu of that, he swiftly becomes an unlikable, selfish child throwing a tantrum, which, in a lot of ways, is exactly what he is. The show even directly admits it at one point, and the narrative shifts gears from being a compelling exploration of the hedonistic calculus towards a more generic beware he who fights monsters thrust. Admittedly, that was always a part of it, but it really begins to supersede the other aspects of the story as it progresses, which is a shame. The issue with trying to do a sympathetic victim story with a he who fights monsters twist is that Hyaki, who doesn't have much of a personality to speak of, basically starts at neutral and slides down without any opportunity to redeem himself or make us think his tragic fall is something depressing that's outside of his control. Instead, it just sort of comes across as him being the vicious homicidal maniac he may very well always have been. Early on, Hyakimaru, who's trained his whole life to kill demons on sight, oh shit, I shouldn't have said that, elects to let a Spider-Woman leave as he realizes she's not the evil creature he thought she was. This was the first episode to end on a positive note, and it hinted at some kind of emotional growth on Hyaki's part. As a friend said to me when discussing the show during its closing few episodes, I can't see the Hyakimaru of episode 20 onwards doing that. Somehow, over the course of the show, he becomes a less nuanced character. I get that this is a recurrent thing in Japanese media. Religious studies is compulsory for the first few years of high school, after all. I studied the Noble Eightfold Path, I get the breaking of the cycle of samsara, these are all concepts that I'm familiar with. I've gone down with the Buddha. I'm also familiar with that whole if someone kills a lot of people they lose their humanity and become a Shura narrative device as well. That's a quintessential part of Japanese mythology, but that doesn't change the fact that the character who's losing his humanity needs to be more consistent and more compelling for me to actually care that he's falling from grace, rather than just starting from zero and working his way down. It's the narrative equivalent of kicking a eunuch in the groin. Oedipus is a tragic hero because he tries to stop what's foretold and in the end enables it. Hyaki just sort of screams about how he wants his body back, and in the process, becomes more and more heartless. I don't feel pity for Hyakimaro, I just have that kind of feeling you get when you see that guy in RoboCop get blasted by ED-209. There's a sort of sine wave between plot-centric and Monster of the Week episodes here, and one of my real issues is with the pacing of it all. As good as the vignettes can be, they don't add much to the overall story after a certain point, as with that whole business with the moths. Ideally, you'd tie narrative into the Monster of the Week episodes, but quite a few feel distinctly separate. I suppose that's the price you pay for being a 24-episode series, just like the average trip down your standard Buru page, or unfortunately bound to run into some kind of artificial inflation. The reason why I loved Dororo for its first half was that I felt as though it was constantly surprising me in interesting, exciting ways. It was like what Rian Johnson wanted The Last Jedi to be, with the major distinction being that everything in Dororo felt earned. It's edgy, yes, but the edge is earned. It has a point. It serves the plot, and it doesn't feel like it's trying too hard to do so. It's a mature story for intelligent, smart people, like my cool uncle, but it feels like somewhere along the way that nuance was lost, or was at least dampened. It's still a compelling show for the most part, and I would argue it was still worth watching overall, but ultimately it does smack a bit of wasted potential. If only Hyakimaro had just actually talked a few episodes before, been given a chance to develop a character, I might have taken to this one so much more. All he'd need to do is have that one scene where he wonders if what he's doing is right, but he never really dwells on the suffering of others until the 11th hour, at which point it's too little too late. It's almost out of nowhere. As it stands, it feels like they simply overestimated how sympathetic I'd be towards Hyakimaro, although it's very possible that's just because I've yet to get my capacity for emotion back from the demons to whom my father traded my very flesh. Now, it's true that this review has basically been a tearing down of how Hyakimaro was... well, I suppose I can't say written exactly, but he's the biggest black mark against the show for me personally. Otherwise, it is a very potent parable about the terrible costs of war beyond the battlefield. It does more than most to highlight the human suffering resulting from the conflict, rather than focusing on the conflict itself. And in fairness, I think the conclusion the story reaches is the correct one. It just took too long to get there, and then took half the time it needed to resolve everything satisfactorily. More than almost anything I've yet reviewed, Dororo is going to be incredibly subjective, really. As I said before, our dynamic duo are going to make or break this show for you, and for me, Hyakimaro worked about as well as the elevators at the Hilton Suites did right before the unfortunate cable malfunction that led to the untimely demise of my cool uncle. The reason why I've harped on him so much, Hyakimaro, I mean, not my cool uncle, is because I don't think this would have been a difficult problem to fix. It's depressingly easy to see the timeline where this was an excellent show, if only it hadn't insisted on having its protagonist be a Roomba with a knife taped to it.